And I see we're starting to get more participants, so we'll start now. Hi, my name is Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. It's my pleasure to have you with us and to hear the wisdom of my friend Suzanne Nossel this afternoon on the issue of hate and vilification of the media. Suzanne is the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America, which is a leading human rights and free expression organization. And before that, she was the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and the Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. She was also, among other things, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of international organizations during the Obama administration. You know, I'm a longtime member of PEN. I'm a fan of the work that it's done, particularly in the last few years since Suzanne has taken it over. I'm an admirer of her work for a long time. I should also point out that the timing on this particular topic is great. She has a new book that is coming out next week, which I'm eager to read, called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. There it is. And I should also, mention that she's married to an old friend too, David Greenberg, who's an historian from Rutgers. And I'm eager to read when he finishes his new book, which is a biography of John Lewis. And the way this program came about is I emailed both David and Suzanne and a few others when I was thinking about important topics for these webinars about hate. And, we've had programs in the last number of weeks about hate in the brain and hate around the COVID virus and hate in the aftermath of George Floyd. But I also wanted to have programs that look at hate in other ways, maybe ones that we're not usually thinking about. And one of them is when hate isn't directed at particularly, people per se based on their identifying race or sexual orientation or religion or so forth, but at important institutions. I've argued for a long time there's a correlation between the strength of democratic institutions and our ability to confront hate. And then when democratic institutions erode, we don't see it all at once. It's like infrastructure on a highway. It can rust and it isn't immediately apparent, but sooner or later it catches up and we see the damage done. And, that's why I thought the attacks on the press is something that we should focus in on. We may all have issues with how the press reports certain things, how it works, and that's fine. But the idea that the press is an identifiable enemy of the people, like others have been targeted, like, Jews in Nazi Germany or capitalists in the former Soviet Union, that's something I find troubling, and it resonates with something that I wrote about years ago when the militia movement, and right before the Oklahoma City bombing and in the aftermath of the bombing. That phrase may not have been used, but the imagery was. And federal officials as the enemy of the people was a core belief of those who ended up blowing up the Oklahoma City Federal Building. And at that time, there were only a few marginal political figures that were echoing that sentiment. But now it comes from leadership of the country and other leaders in other parts of the world that raises my concern. So when I was talking to David and Suzanne and others about who could talk about this, everybody said, there's only one person, and that's Suzanne. So that's why she's here today, to share her wisdom with you. She's going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up to questions. The way we'll do questions is there's a Q&A box. Type the questions in. I will then repeat those to Suzanne, and we'll be out of here in an hour. All of you wiser for having listened to her. So Suzanne, welcome. Thank you so much for spending the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Ken. It's great to see you, even virtually, and we've appreciated our collaborations over time between the Institute and PEN America. And I'm delighted to talk about this topic. I think it's an interesting frame to think about the vilification of journalists alongside vilification of other groups. And, that is a phenomenon that I think, would have been pretty much unimaginable to many of us as Americans in our own country, even 5 years ago, and yet is now something that we must contend with. And I think you're right to think about it both journalists as being the targets of vilification and journalists in a free press as being one of the checks on the the movement of society toward a climate of bigotry and denigration and hatred. And so I think there's an interplay there. And to me, look, we've always had controversy in this country over the role of the press, and we've always had journalists who overstep bounds and who were tendentious and even mendacious in what they published. And the press is a rough and tumble arena, and a certain amount of conflict and controversy in relation to it is natural. And there's always also a natural tension, I think, between journalists and presidents of the United States. And they're there to hold the president accountable, and the president wants to portray a certain image and to control the message and to rally support and to burnish their reputation, and the press can sometimes stand in the way of that. So, that's the backdrop of kind of the natural tensions. And then I think what we have had over the last sort of 4 years and change is something much more sinister. And I date it back to Trump's initial campaign when he began vilifying individual journalists. We all remember, that kind of horrifying video of him making fun of Serge Kovaleski, or the spectacle of Jorge Ramos being dragged out of a Trump rally. And it was really sort of individual journalists that got under his skin, that he came to see as standing in the way of his ambitions or providing critical coverage. And he would begin by sort of needling them, denigrating them personally, an edge of mockery. So some of the attributes, and qualities that I think we see in hatred toward ethnic groups and religious minorities, showing their face in Trump's behavior. But once he became president, I think it took on a new dimension and was a deliberate strategy where he recognized that he was going to break all previous molds of what a president had done, and that I think that a lot of what he would do would be unpopular. He obviously lost the popular vote, and so entered the White House with a kind of razor thin margin of support. And I think his notion was to discredit the press so that they would not interfere with his ability to message to his base, and he could say whatever he wanted to his base. And if the media contradicted him, his supporters would be so indoctrinated and inured to doubt what they read or heard that they would believe him over journalists and news outlets. And that campaign began, and the rhetoric escalated, including calling the press the enemies of the American people, calling out individual news outlets by name, the failing New York Times and Washington Post, media owners like Jeff Bezos, individual reporters at White House press conferences, and kind of a steady trope of his time in office from the early days became this drumbeat of harsh criticism and a kind of menacing tone toward journalists that was beyond what we'd seen in other contexts. And what we saw at PEN America ultimately and took action on was something that went in even further, which were threats and acts of retaliation against the press. Because even the president of the United States has First Amendment rights. If he wants to make fun of a reporter or be dismissive or obnoxious, or even use a slur, he can do that. That's protected under the First Amendment. But what he cannot do is threaten and then use the machinery of government to retaliate against journalists or the press. That violates the First Amendment. And so we actually filed a lawsuit in 2018 challenging a series of threats and attacks of acts of retaliation, including withholding press passes from Jim Acosta and other journalists on the basis of critical questions that they had asked of him, ordering a probe more intensively into the AT&T Time Warner merger because of his animus toward CNN, ordering the raising of postal rates on Amazon, and linking that to his hostility toward the Washington Post and its coverage of him. And so we assembled all this and engaged experts and First Amendment attorneys and filed this lawsuit. It has been slow going, although we withstood the government's motion to dismiss just early on this spring in April. Federal court in New York ruled in our favor, allowing our case to proceed. It's a difficult case at a number of levels. It's sort of unprecedented to have to sue the President of the United States for violating the First Amendment in this way, but we think it's extremely important to vindicate the idea that a President of the United States must not use his power to mobilize the bureaucracy in reprisals against media coverage that he dislikes. So we believe there's an extremely important principle at stake. And I'd say over the last couple of years, that commitment has been intensified by witnessing the reverberating effects of Trump's hostile attitude toward the press and vilification of the press. And, I'd say the first incident that really jumped out was before the 2018 midterms when then congressional candidate Greg Gianforte in Montana body slammed Guardian reporter Ben Jacobs, who was sort of a little bit in his face and asking questions that Gianforte didn't want to answer. And he just shoved Jacobs down to the ground and, then went on to win his election and serve in Congress. And, that was something we hadn't really seen, I don't think, in recent memory in this country, kind of such an overt assault against a member of the press. And there have been a few other similar examples of just, not physical violence, but state houses shutting the media out, denying credentials based on perceptions of unfavorable coverage, and just taking a harsher, more belligerent attitude toward the media than we'd seen previously. And I would say where it really came to a head was in the course of the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd all over the country. You had people taking to the streets and a tense standoff with police. And alongside other organizations, there's a consortium of media freedom and free expression organizations that collectivize our data with respect to violations of press freedom. And over 500 incidents of press freedom violations were documented in the course of the protests. And, some of them were sort of essentially journalists being caught in the crossfire. There was tear gas being fired against protesters or even rubber bullets, and journalists just happened to be there out on the street and they were targeted alongside everyone else. But a significant proportion were really more than that. They were targeted assaults on members of the press. There's that very high profile, which I'm sure many of you saw, arrest of CNN reporter Omar Jimenez in Minneapolis. He was doing his job very calmly with a camera crew, very professional, asked the cops where he should stand. It made clear his intent to get out of their way. And yet they arrest him and haul him away. And, after him come his cameraman and his producer, and the whole crew was hauled off. And it was a big embarrassment, and they released him quickly and they apologized. But that notion that a police officer would think it appropriate and acceptable to, believe it or not, on national television, actually apprehend a journalist in the line of duty is really something that we haven't seen in this country. And it was not the only incident. There were dozens of arrests, dozens of assaults, and just a level of antagonism and antipathy and dismissiveness toward the role of the press. I think the press, for many of the police departments, seems to have been perceived as, sort of an enemy, sort of some, people who were there to cover this story that was a difficult story to manage, protests against police violence, and believing that the press bore some blame for a narrative that police didn't want to be heard or felt was critical, and that they were willing to turn their power against journalists and do so in some instances violently. And there were also a number of instances of international journalists from Britain and Australia caught up in this. And, for us at PEN America, we do a lot of international work, and, much of it focuses on writers who are persecuted and imprisoned all over the world. And a great many of them, increasingly, it used to be, I think decades ago, was sort of more poets and intellectuals and novelists. And these days, there's some of that, but there are also a lot of journalists. And of course, there are also more people who cross over and do long form writing as well as journalism. You know, they may do artistic work or make videos. So there are more people who sort of fall into the category of journalism. And of course, it's an incredibly pervasive pattern in authoritarian regimes all over the world that journalists are attacked, undermined, thwarted in their ability to do their work. They're vilified. They can be tried on false charges. You know, in Russia, you know, they now sort of try to find charges of pedophilia or other kinds of moral crimes to bring against writers and journalists as a way of discrediting them and trying to convince their audiences that they shouldn't be listened to or given credence. And so this, you know, sort of a lot of talk about the authoritarian playbook, but this really is a set of moves that do come right out of the authoritarian playbook. Of course, the most pervasive and consequential regime of vilification of independent media is China, where you really have no indigenous independent media, or such as it is. It's incredibly people who are operating underground in incredibly confined space, but now a more overt assault on Western media and the ouster of New York reporters from the New York Times and Voice of America and Washington Post over the last few months, and now even from Hong Kong, New York Times reporters having their visas denied, and a further shutting down of an already very narrow aperture through which the world can look at what's happening in China and try to understand it. And you know, this pattern in the US, one of the things that's so disturbing about it from our perspective is the degree to which it undercuts any credibility that the US has as a standard bearer for press freedom around the world, which is an important role that we played. You know, something else that bears mention in this conversation is that in international human rights law, you know, where you have a lot of attention paid to the treatment of minorities and vulnerable groups and issues like racism and sexism, you also have a recognition in international human rights fora of the importance of journalists and rejecting attacks on journalists, protecting journalists. There are a whole series of resolutions that focus on the importance of governments upholding the ability of a free press to do its job. And so there is some support for the idea that respect for the role of journalists is something that, you know, forms part of the human rights system and implicates rights that governance need to uphold. And, you know, that could become potentially a basis for sort of elaborating on this question of vilification of journalists and why it's so harmful and what needs to be done about it. So I think I will stop there and we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Suzanne. And let me encourage people to type in questions. There's one already before I'm gonna ask you a couple too, but it's the easiest one. Could you hold up your book so people can get the title of it again?
Of course. It's called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. And it's basically organized around 20 principles for how we can live together in our diverse, digitized and divided society without curbing free speech. And, you know, if any of you, as I'm sure you have been, you know, watching just the kind of avalanche of speech-related controversies over the last days and weeks, whether it's the Harper's letter, or Barry Weiss's resignation, or, you know, AOC and this contretemps with Representative Yoho, or Whole Foods disciplining employees for wearing Black Lives Matter masks, or prison authorities apprehending Michael Cohen because he wants to write a book and won't agree to relinquish that right. I sort of deal with the whole gamut of issues that we confront in free speech today. A lot of it deals with free speech issues on campus, which I know has been a big concern at Bard. There's actually some discussion of the visit of Mark Yongan to Bard and the issues that his appearance raised. I hope you will take a look at it. I have a whole slew of book events coming up around the country, and thanks for asking about it.
Great. So let me ask a couple of questions, and then we have some that are populating in. I encourage people to ask more. So one of the things that interested me is when I announced this, we have a email list with a few thousand people. I got some pushback, which was interesting. One related to the very wise New York Times thing that the world would be better off without the New York Times, but another was from a epidemiologist at Yale who said that he's written things about hydroxychloroquine as a positive impact, and the mainstream media is not allowing that to be on, and he's pushing it, and he's, the guy has credentials. So, but his point was that he sees the mainstream media as a problem. I don't know that he would go that far as vilification, but he wasn't seemingly upset with the idea of seeing the press as an enemy in that way. So one question would be, how do you divide the idea of what's a reasonable concerns to have about the media, and where is it problematic when it falls over into the vilification of the press as an institution as a problem?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question because I do think people recognize that even in the most hyperbolic criticism of the media, there can be some kernel of truth and, some way in which journalism overreaches or reflects bias or blurs the lines between factual reporting and opinion. And I think it's extremely important in an environment like this for media outlets to be scrupulous in their own fact checking, in the how they handle questions of bias in their reporting, and how they staff themselves, and whether they have diverse staffs, both racially, gender-wise, as well as ideologically. To in investigations, make certain that all protocols are respected, because any lapse or gap or failing, and they do happen, like in any arena, there are mistakes that are made, right now is seized upon as evidence to feed into this campaign of vilification. And there certainly have been instances where media outlets and individual journalists have slipped up and fed those kinds of criticisms. I also think there's something more fundamental at work. That's sort of the interplay of some of the failings and shortcomings of the media and this relentless campaign of denigration that's been waged by the White House and taken up by the right-wing media and many online commentators, such that people have really become doubtful about, whether journalists are just bloviating, whether there's actual real reporting going on, and whether what you read in the New York Times or see on CNN can be believed. And one thing we've also come upon is that there's very little knowledge and awareness often of what goes into a reported story, and the level of meticulousness that professional journalists uphold, and the thresholds of vetting and gating and editing that apply to major news publications, such that when something makes it into print or online at a reputable news organization, for the most part, you can stand by it. And obviously when they make mistakes, as they occasionally do, that gets thrown into question. But one of the things we've done as we've expanded our work across the country is trying to strengthen the relationship between communities and the news outlets that serve them, so that people better understand, who's really making the news? Who are these people behind the bylines? How do they do this? Do they actually travel to the places that they're writing about? Have they talked to anybody inside the police department before they publish their story? What sources are they looking at? What standards of verification are there? How many witnesses do they need to have before they write something? I think that awareness is pretty low, and that can sort of feed these negative perceptions.
Great. So we have a couple of questions about the Harper's letter. So let me just put that on. Before I said, journalists can be intimidated by the state. Can you say something about other sorts of intimidation in light of the Harper's letter? Somebody also referred to, I guess it's related to that, unless you want to see it differently, about Barry Weiss's resignation and the problem. What do you think of the cancel culture? And then there's a third one that about the Harper's letter.
I want.
Okay,
I mean,
do with that, and then I'll ask you that other question. Go ahead.
I don't. I mean, I don't know. I'd like to look, either have you repeat the question or give me a second to read the question so I know what people are actually.
Sure. So once it's so journalists can be intimidated by the state, can you say something about other sorts of intimidation in light of the Harper's letter? And then
Yes. Okay. Let's start with that.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, something we do a lot of work on at PEN America, and a program that we've stood up in the last couple of years, focuses on online harassment, and particularly of journalists and writers. And we have documented through our own surveys that censorious sort of force of online harassment, to the point where journalists go off social media, or they refrain from discussing certain topics, or sometimes even leave behind their careers because it can be so toxic and noxious. And yet, to be a successful journalist, depending on what your beat is, you know, it may be really necessary to be on social media so that you're engaging with sources and readers, and you know, part of the discussion that you're trying to be a voice within. And so we have a whole program that is aimed to mitigate the censorious effects of online harassment and support people who are targeted by it. So that is definitely one set of threats, you know, that obviously speaks directly to the Harper's letter. I mean, I think the letter talks about also people who face concrete reprisals, institutional reprisals, be they corporate or from an academic institution, on the basis of speech. But very often that gets sort of ginned up by online outrage and pressure on officials to exact discipline against an individual who said something that people are very upset about. And, you know, look, criticism and opposition and the expression of opposing views is part of free speech, and you should be able to do that. But one of the challenges is that on social media, the format of it and the nature of it it creates this momentum behind pile-ons, where people are very often looking at things out of context. There's a premium on speed and wit and pithiness, and so people just jump into the fray. And for the person on the receiving end, it can seem thunderous and overwhelming. And for an institution that is trying to react, you know, that sort of snowballing outrage can seem so forceful that they feel almost like they have no choice but to give into it. So I do think it's very important to focus not just on governmental threats to free speech and press freedom, but extra governmental as well.
Thank you. So here's another question. Trump would have been forgotten decades ago without the complicity and symbiotic dependency he and the media have with each other. What responsibility do journalists have to contain their enablement of people like Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. You see now, you know, it almost feels like a penance going on, you know, in some media outlets that do feel they played a role in enabling Trump because he was, you know, it was such a great story to cover and it was so entertaining, and some journalists had personal relationships with him, and, you know, they're almost now bending over backwards to call him out for his mishandling of the pandemic and other things. And, you know, that in turn, though, can also feed the perception that we were talking about a few minutes ago, that the media is one-sided, that it has an agenda, that it's out to get Trump, which of course is, you know, what he wants you to believe. And so it's a very delicate balance, I think, between, you know, providing objective, credible, serious and fact-based coverage, you know, particularly of a very polarizing and sort of sui generis figure, where, you know, if you had called him out as a wannabe authoritarian during the 2016 campaign, you would have been going on pretty scant evidence. And so that was hard to do. And, you know, there were also media outlets that didn't seem to take him seriously. And then, you know, his supporters got very upset about that would cover him under an arts and culture entertainment heading rather than in the politics section early on. And they were criticized for failing to recognize the political force that he represented. So Look, I think there are some difficult judgment calls. I'm not sure. I think it's going to be a while before we really understand and absorb the full lessons of this.
Okay, thank you. So here's another question. The critics of the Harper's letter speak of power imbalance. They say that the signatories, even if facing some heat, are privileged and have access to major media outlets, and what's happening in social media is a response to that. To that extent, this is democratization. Those who have signed don't have a perfect record protecting free speech either. How does one navigate the space? Is it possible to have a balance there? What recourse do those who feel offended by remarks have? And while no platforming and doxing are wrong, what other ways are available for those who claim they are offended?
Sure. I mean, look, there's a lot. There's a lot in that question. I'll make a few comments. I mean, I think one of the points is it's true that a lot of people who signed that letter do have platforms at a certain degree of security, but it's also true that they're, I think, trying to speak on behalf of also those who do not, and that those who do not might not be in a position to sign a letter like that, because you saw the level of blowback that it generated. And if someone was an untenured professor or a lecturer or an adjunct and signed that letter, you can imagine that they might not be renewed. And they, that very, the very act of signing the letter could put them in jeopardy. And so in a sense, I think that helps to explain why it is that you sort of need people who have a bit more security to speak up. And I actually talk about in the book, that those who are in positions of security need to sort of sometimes step forward and take on controversial ideas and be the voice of viewpoints where other people feel muzzled by circumstance, but that have some value and deserve to be articulated. I argue in the book for sort of a series of interlacing principles that I believe can allow us to drive forward a more equal, inclusive, and just society, but without compromising robust protections for free speech. And I think it kind of requires things on all sides of these debates. I mean, I have a chapter devoted to using language conscientiously, and I think that's important. I think that's something, at times some commentators who get into hot water really were not as careful as you need to be in 2020, when you know that anything you put out there is going to kind of travel around the world, and it's going to reach the eyes and ears of very diverse audiences. And so there's a higher responsibility to think that through, maybe to vet it by somebody who's from a particular group that can give you insight to how it might land. I have a chapter on sort of the duty of care that attaches when you have a bigger platform. If you're the president of the university, or you have your own show, or you're a prominent entertainer, even just at the front of a classroom in a lecture hall, there are added responsibilities, I think, go above and beyond what you need to do when you're sort of at the dinner table with your family, or you're just a student on campus. So I also talk about apologies for speech and when those are appropriate and how to make them authentic, and when speech should be forgiven. I think we need space for people to make mistakes and misstep, and recognize that our mores are changing very quickly, and that not everybody's going to get it right all the time. And if we have a zero tolerance policy, to me that's very chilling, because you're sort of afraid to say anything for fear that a two-word phrase could cost you your job.
And that leads into the next question, which you just addressed part of it, but not the entirety of it. So what do you think of Bari Weiss's resignation, and how much of a problem do you think the cancel culture is?
I mean, I'm not sure she's an example of cancel culture, because her resignation is voluntary. I think it's unfortunate if at a place like the New York Times, viewpoint diversity is that hard to sustain, and somebody who is a kind of contrarian in many people's eyes is ridiculed and mocked and even sort of harassed in the way that she said she was. I also think there's probably some level of kind of conscientiousness that might have helped to prevent some of that, and soften the edges somewhat, so that she could have articulated her views in a way that would have been better received. I also wonder if the timing of this, after many months of pandemic, when it's impossible to talk. I think face-to-face conversation is actually one of the things that, really can help to bridge these disagreements and enable even people who are on diametrically opposite sides of an issue to see one another's humanity and find, a kernel of something they can understand in what the other person is saying, and, work from there to see whether there's a bit more common ground. I think that's been made more difficult, over time. Obviously, we've been relying more and more on social media, and I think it's now sort of extreme in that, people aren't sitting around the New York Times newsroom and, mediating these issues with one another. So, I think we have to guard against the effects of our sort of distanced, Zoom-centric, social media-centric pandemic society and some of its negative side effects for free speech and for our open discourse.
So that raises a question I want to ask you before I jump into these others. So that struck me as a very good point. Not only the fear of the COVID, but the fact that we're all not really having these human interactions. Do you think that helps promote the idea of the press as this evil entity because people aren't having these informal conversations? I mean, you think we're in an environment that could lead to sort of a heightened, even more of a vilification, or do you think it?
I mean, it's kind of interesting. One issue that we've done a lot of work on at PEN America is the crisis in local news across the country. And we got into it because after 2016, we really expanded we were quite a New York-centric organization, but we always had members living across the country and now in all 50 states. And after the 2016 election, we were able to step up our engagement with them. And when we talked to them about, what are the press freedom concerns that are top of your mind, top of our mind, frankly, was Donald Trump. Top of their minds was the fact that their local newsrooms were being decimated with cuts. And, it was economically driven because of the collapse of print advertising, which for many decades had enabled these thriving businesses in local communities. And of course, all that advertising migrated online, and these legacy newspapers were not the ones getting it. It was going to Facebook and Google and other outlets. And so we've seen more than 20% of local news outlets shut their doors, and among the rest, roughly 50% cuts in newsroom staffs. And we did a big report called Losing the News that we issued last fall, documenting all of this and the crisis that it represents for democracy. Now, in the context of COVID, and we actually thought in issuing that report, one of our recommendations was a congressional commission to examine public funding for news, which hasn't been seriously overhauled in more than 3 decades. And we think is, no panacea. We were hesitant to even recommend it because, ideally we wouldn't want the government playing a significant role in underwriting news production, but it does work successfully in other countries, and there really is no other, philanthropy is one solution, but it's only a very small part of the revenue gap that philanthropy is able to make up for. In any case, we thought this Congressional Commission on Local News would be, go absolutely nowhere until we had a new Congress and, post-2020 election. And in fact, what we've seen during the pandemic is dramatically increased interest in the fate of local news, both across the country and in Washington, because people really see, this is a local story. The infection rates, the hospitals, where you access PPE and testing, what the schools are going to do. And, people are desperate for this information. It's local news outlets that are providing it, and they've been designated as essential workers in most of these communities. So they were out there, even during the lockdown, doing their work. And people have really come to recognize what an essential service they perform. Of course, unfortunately, the economic crisis they face has only been exacerbated by the national economic collapse. And so there's a greater sense of urgency. So I actually see that as a positive thing. I mean, there is serious discussion in Washington around a number of different proposals to help strengthen and support local news. And, we've always seen statistically that local news and media is more trusted than national. So that doesn't necessarily carry over to what people think about the New York Times and CNN, but I think it is a glimmer of hope.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine two short questions because they lead into each other. So, is there anything the average person can do to combat the vilification of the press and to uphold our critical need for a free press and disseminating information and upholding human rights? And the other is, more generally, how should we cope with the attack on journalists?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot you can do. I mean, first of all, supporting local media just as a subscriber is extremely important because all of these outlets have become more dependent on subscription revenue as ad revenue has dried up. In conversation with people when they vilify the press, arming yourself with basic understanding of how journalists do their work so you can push back, and if there's a mistake that they're upset about, you can point out, contextualize that and make clear that one error or misstatement is not grounds to dismiss an entire publication. Sharing credible news. Another kind of piece of this puzzle that we haven't touched on is the rise of disinformation, which is an issue that PEN America does a lot of work on. And the emergence of these shadow sites that look like credible news outlets. Sometimes they imitate local news outlets because the brands are less known, and you see something from whatever, the Denver Courant, and you don't know if that's a serious paper or it could be a front for any kind of agenda. And so one thing that we have done a lot of work on is the importance as you purvey information on social media or to your contacts and email, to make sure you understand what it is that you are sharing. And sometimes it's the most incendiary story that you want to share because it's so outrageous or outlandish, but it may be a Russian bot that is disguising itself as a newspaper from Fort Worth. And so you've got to do a little bit of digging and due diligence to make sure that it is what it seems to be, and make sure that you're not a vector for disinformation.
Sure. And one of the things that you didn't add, but I will, is support organizations like PEN. For this is their
yes.
spot.
Join PEN America as a member.
Yes.
And a supporter, and get involved in all of our work and programs on these issues and support them, which I absolutely would welcome and encourage, and we'd love to get you involved.
Great. So this one question feeds off one of the other ones about the media's fixation with Trump and the symbiotic relation, but it's looking at it a little differently. So when Trump refers to fake news, isn't he right in the sense that many news outlets are far more preoccupied with what he tweets than what is actually going on in the world, especially outside U.S. borders?
Look, we sort of have tried to avoid using the term fake news because it's become so meaningless. I mean, he uses it to refer to news he doesn't like, or a critical take or headline, often from a mainstream news outlet. So I think he's sort of decanted all meaning from the phrase. We prefer the phrase fraudulent news, which also, imparts the idea of intent, that somebody is willfully trying to deceive. What he calls fake news is really just news he doesn't like, or reporting with a cast or a tone that he rejects. Has the news media played into that by overemphasizing the tweets? I think at times, I do think there's some stories about Trump that, we'd be better off if they didn't run. Some I think are too one-sidedly critical, and there are examples, including I talk about some in the book, where people take his remarks out of context, and just use it to feed and prop up the most negative perceptions of him. But if you look at his full sentence, you realize, he wasn't actually saying these teenagers from Long Island are terrorists or whatever. He was making a more focused comment about gang members. And so I think it's extremely important to avoid the propensity for a journalist to allow their preconceptions to color their coverage, and to cover the news in a way that just reinforces those preconceptions. And I think editors bear a significant responsibility to correct against that. That said, I think some of his tweets are absolutely newsworthy, and they are the way that policy is articulated. I mean, I was just taking a look at John Bolton's book, and he's talking about how they retaliated against chemical attacks in Syria, and the White House spokesperson was instructed to say, you know, our policy is represented by the president's tweets, and the UN ambassador, you know, had the same instructions. And so if they're using that as a statement of policy, you know, I don't think the press has any choice but to cover it.
Great. So we have two questions basically about the same thing. So I'll read you one. So do you believe the New York Times was correct initially to print the op-ed by U.S. Senator Tom Cotton?
I mean, I don't think the question, I mean, would I have made that same judgment? I don't know. I don't think that that op-ed or such an op-ed should necessarily have been out of the question. You know, I think he's a sitting senator. You know, he represents a viewpoint. I think it's a very dangerous viewpoint, but where, you know, what I think was troubling was that it seemed as though the editors didn't recognize the import of the moment and of publishing such a piece in that moment. The fact that the chief opinion editor said that he had not actually read the piece, like that to me was sort of a misreading of the moment we were in as a country, which was, you know, as you all remember, this kind of knife's edge situation where it seemed as if the president was about to really clamp down forcibly on peaceful protesters. And so if you're going to publish a piece at a moment like that, I think you want to scrub it very, very carefully and think hard about why you're putting it out there. And so it seemed like there was a bit of a kind of cavalierness and, you know, whatever, I'm sure normal protocols maybe were followed, but to not recognize that that sort of piece in that kind of moment warranted a higher level of scrutiny, to me did seem like a lapse.
Okay, so here's a longer question that goes into a little bit more of the legal stuff than the thinking about the vilification of the press and the hate related. But since you're an expert on this, I'll ask you this as well. So could you give us a sense of what is the area of boundary between free speech and abusive behavior? As a background, I may soon become the moderator of a large professional group. My predecessor, a generous and even-handed, in my opinion, colleague, lost his job for not checking a couple of vitriolic messages from two members of listservs. One of the members of the listserv declared him or herself offended, contacted the university, and the moderator became an ex-moderator. So moderating is essential, if for nothing else, for the real legal implications. Hence, can you give us a sense of what is the area of boundary between free speech and abusive behavior for which one can legally get in trouble? The intention of my question goes far beyond legal issues. It's more of restoring civility, the interactions. However, I acknowledge that the determination of civility, just like the determination of fairness, is a popular sport in our country.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's hard to answer very specifically, and I don't know the context of this board that the questioner would be moderating, and whether it's, you know, is it at a university, a public university, a private university, or students on this board. So those kinds of questions would come into it. You know, in terms of the legal boundaries for speech, and I have a whole chapter on this in my book. I talk, you know, I kind of go through what are the exceptions to the First Amendment, because as you know, it doesn't protect all speech. We have libel, we have defamation, we have threats and harassment and other types of speech that can be banned and punished, notwithstanding the First Amendment, but they are defined pretty narrowly. And so on a chat board, if it's harassing speech, if it's, you know, speech, for example, that would deprive someone of a right to an equal education because they're a woman, like say it's, you know, it's a chemistry messaging board and there's all kinds of misogynistic comments so that, you know, a woman would not feel comfortable there, you know, I think she might, well, you know, have a case that, you know, there's a civil rights claim there, and that if the university is sponsoring this and it's something that's part of your education, that they have an obligation to keep that kind of harassing content off of it. You know, I think the harder questions come in with speech that tends to be protected by the First Amendment and yet still deeply objectionable and offensive. And this comes up a lot. And I think moderators have to understand the mores of the communities that they're managing. And, you know, of course, there may not be perfect consensus. And there may be, you know, some posts that people think are, you know, definitively out of bounds, where others agree, believe it's sort of be part of the discourse, and that you're being censorious if you take it down. And so I think it's partially a question of what are the articulated precepts of this community. Is it subject matter specific? Is there a commitment to being respectful to one another? I think I'd say you do have to be very attentive to objectionable speech, and to when people register an objection, if you're able to sort of jump on it and let them know you're on it, and take it down, and you can often kind of work it through. And it's sort of, if it festers and the moderator is sort of seen to be asleep at the switch, then things can escalate.
Thank you. So I have a question from somebody in the UK. Said, here in the UK, our press certainly is politically aligned, and it is said that whomever Rupert Murdoch supports ends up running our country. In addition, recently the phrase enemy of the people was used by certain of the right-wing press to describe 3 judges who ruled in favor of Gina Miller when she took our government to court in order to give Parliament a say in our leaving the EU. Our Prime Minister is also a journalist and has been the subject of considerable criticism for his descriptions of ethnic and religious minorities that have been said to incite racial and religious attacks. I don't know how qualified you feel to answer UK-specific question, but how does such irresponsible and blatantly partisan journalism engender trust in mainstream media, or feed the growing levels of vilification of our press and rejection of what is reported?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a serious issue, and it's an issue we obviously have here in this country. Maybe not to quite the same degree, but I think a lot of people believe that Fox News, played an indispensable role in Trump's election, and also in his ability to sustain support to the degree that he has. And yet it's a company that is free to operate what they do, does not violate the First Amendment, is legally protected. So that is a real challenge. I think part of it is trying to educate people about what constitutes credible journalism, and why it is that living in Texas or Kansas, if you believe in your local media outlet and the work they do, you might have some questions to ask about Fox. But Fox is complicated because they do have some serious journalists. Like, it's not monolithic. And then they, one of the things that I think is sort of the most troubling developments is this kind of blurring of the lines between news and what I think of as talk television, which is really not news, but shows that are on, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, but there's no actual reporting that's being conveyed through that show. It's talking heads giving their opinions, what would happen on talk radio. And yet the boundary line between that and the news has really blurred. And sometimes you have, 6 heads up on the screen, and some of them are from political campaigns. And you might also have a real reporter who, has just found something out at the White House, but they're all sort of boxed together as if what they have to offer is equivalent, and it isn't. And so I think part of it is trying to strengthen those boundaries between news and opinion, and for a station like Fox News, those shows to make clear what they are. Like I wish it wasn't called news, because it isn't.
One of the speakers that we had before the pandemic that actually came to campus is a BARD alum named Matt Taibbi, who wrote a book, the title Hate, I forget the subtitle, but it was basically approaching part of what you were just referring to. And his thesis was looking at cable television, and Fox on one hand and MSNBC and CNN on the other. And he described their formula basically as, instead of a complex problem that we're all somehow responsible for and we have to figure out what makes us tick, it's an easy problem and it's their fault. And that model seems to drive up ratings, drive up revenue. So, if that's in fact what you're describing, that less journalism, more of feeding into this sort of tabloid television in a way, how does that give a more of a wind to when people like Trump and others are trying to divide us into an us and them, and put the media that may be critical of him into clearly the them category? They're part of the Democrats. They're part of they're How the
No, I
media?
think it does, because you have people who are, I think also part of it is that it's much cheaper to have sort of these talking heads than it is to have reporters in the field, never mind reporting from around the world. And so, they do that for maybe a couple of hours a day, but then they've got to now fill this 24-hour schedule. And so it's sort of inevitable that they, just have this patter going on all day that feeds audiences and very often is playing to a choir that wants to hear certain perspectives amplified, and gets a kick out of certain hosts, whether it's a Rachel Maddow or a Tucker Carlson. And I do think for President Trump, that type of entertainment that is sort of labeled news makes it easier to take aim at these news outlets, because some of what they're doing, really doesn't fit the definition of journalism, with all of its indicia of credibility and professionalism.
Great. So here's another legal question. So can you comment on the legal structural issues, such as Supreme Court rulings and how people receive media, including, quote, both siderism, Fox, quote, news propaganda, which you just addressed, and identifying falsehoods on Facebook or Twitter?
Hello?
Suzanne, you there? Hi, I think you're back. You bleeped out for a second. So you want me to repeat that?
Okay.
Can you comment on the legal structural issues, such as Supreme Court rulings on how people receive media, including both siderism, in quotes, Fox, quote, news propaganda, which I think you just addressed, and identifying falsehoods on Facebook and Twitter?
Yeah, Facebook and Twitter, raise really complicated issues, and I argue I have several chapters devoted to them in the book. And what I argue is that we need to be vigilant, sort of from two sides. We should not give companies unfettered, unchecked power to moderate and police our discourse and take down whatever content and viewpoints they choose. That poses dangers that are not entirely dissimilar from giving that power to a governmental entity. They're different, but companies have their own motives. They will use those powers in self-serving ways. So I think there's a real danger there. At the same time, we do see many categories of online content being hurtful and dangerous, whether it's cyberbullying or terrorist content or disinformation that can undercut our democracy. And so I don't think we can let companies off the hook. I think we're going to see much more aggressive policing and takedowns of content. The pressure right now on Facebook with the boycott based on hateful content is intensifying. So I think they'll have no choice but to more forcefully police content. And then I argue in the book, we need to sort of correct for that by creating a mechanism whereby the inevitable overbreadth of that effort and the kind of legitimate content that gets swept up in it, that people who have a claim that the platforms have baselessly removed their content have a ready recourse, so that we can uphold free speech to the degree possible. So I think there's a lot of work to do. There's no perfect solution, but we need to be kind of leery on both ends.
Great. So I'm going to ask two questions, one that I want to ask and one combining two other questions that are related. So one is, do you think it's possible for journalists to be unbiased when media outlets are owned by people with political agendas? How can a consumer of media distinguish between balanced reporting and propaganda? And related to that is another question about viewpoint diversity. Do we have it in the mainstream media?
Yeah. Okay. I know we're almost out of time, so I'll be quick. I think it can be difficult to distinguish, but you also, there are clear markers of what constitutes credible journalism. Is it sourced? Has the reporter actually spoken to someone? Are they bringing any new information to light? Have they confirmed? Have they done the reporting themselves? Or are they just talking about something that they heard or read elsewhere? And so I think part of it is educating people about what those markers of credible journalism are. And there are people in Fox News who I believe are serious journalists and deserve to be listened to, when they bring something to light. There are also, professional interviewers like a Chris Wallace who are at Fox News. And so, I don't lump, the entirety together. is there viewpoint diversity in the mainstream media? It's because, our society is very polarized right now. And I think we see that, kind of cleavage within the media itself. And I think the Barry Weiss resignation was a manifestation of that, although there are other conservative voices on the opinion pages that, seem to persist and keep going, and that, I think are breaking through and being heard. I think it's a struggle. I think particularly on cable news, it's pretty bifurcated, unfortunately. And I think it's very problematic that we have, a substantial contingent of the country that credits Fox News and no other outlets, and vice versa.
Great. So I have one quick question and a quick answer, and I'll let you go, and appreciate your time. So, we have some people here logging in from around the world, not only the UK, but from Hungary and Berlin and Russia and some other places. So, you're talking about Trump and the promotion, the idea of fake news. Well, we've seen other people and other leaders use that phrase after he started popularizing it, and the similar types of vilification. So how much of an impact do you think he's having abroad? And secondarily, if there are a number of people starting to see the press in this way and popularize it in this way, what are the implications, globally for human rights?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly damaging. I think one piece is that the US has lost all credibility as a defender of free speech. And then we also see these copycat measures, whether it's in Singapore or the Philippines, where governments feel emboldened that they can take from Trump's playbook, and who's going to call them out, because certainly the United States won't do it. And so I think he's created space for all sorts of authoritarian tactics and hostility toward the press. Does that, how long does that persist? And, where does all this go? We don't know. I think it's potentially reversible if it ends soon, but I think it's done real damage.
Well, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. I really appreciate all the work you're doing and sharing your wisdom with us. And, to everybody, thank you for your
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks.